welcome to Life Along the Merrimack. This is a weekly podcast heard on FM radio and seen on local cable TV and YouTube. I am the outreach historian for the Custom House Maritime Museum in Newburyport, and here we talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. Today my guest is a Newburyport resident well-versed in local government and the river. Paul, welcome here, and one thing I wanted to start with is you have been an aide to Senator Jim Kelcourse and Deputy to Mayor Donna Holliday. How did you get involved in government, and maybe you could just talk about where you went to school and how you got to Newburyport?
Okay. I first started getting involved in government when I was in college. My best friend was going to Boston College, and he asked me to help out on then Representative Richard Tissay's campaign. We held signs, did some basic campaigning, door knocking and things like that. And after Richard had won, he gave us some tickets to the presidential ball down in Washington, D.C., George H.W. Bush's. And I went down there, and I kind of caught the bug. And when I came back to Suffolk University, I ran for vice president in my junior class and won. But that was the last official election that I was in.
And then, you talked a little about earlier, how did you migrate to Newburyport? I think you grew up in Linfield, and now you're in Newburyport. Can you talk about how you got here?
Sure. Both my parents were from Boston, and I was born in Brighton on Commonwealth Avenue. I like to say this because it gives perspective. I was baptized on St. Ignatius Church in Boston College. And when my second brother was born, we lived in an apartment, and we decided to move north to Linfield, which is where I grew up and where I went to high school, in public high school, Linfield High School.
And in terms of, you have a couple brothers in the area, as I understand it. They migrated to Newburyport. Are they still in this area?
Sure. I left Suffolk University my junior year. I got the wanderlust bug, and I traveled down the East Coast. I was in Washington, D.C. on and off for 7 years, Atlanta for 2. And when I moved back, the first place that welcomed me into their community was Newburyport, because it was the first apartment I could get that would allow a dog to be in the apartment.
That's good. We have a lot of dog lovers in this town.
And the second thing was my brother Mark was living on Lime Street, and my brother Peter was living in West Newbury. And we grew up as a pretty tight family, and it was just an easy decision. You
eventually were working for Representative Jim Kelcourse, which is where I met you.
Yes.
How did you get from, say, college to Jim Kelcourse's office?
I met Jim through a mutual friend in Newburyport, and we had started discussing politics, and he let me know he was running for state representative. And I said, well, if there's anything I can do to help. And me, and as well as another small team, really kind of helped Jim, knock on doors and hold signs and become organized and meet different factions of people. And when he won the election, he said, hey, do you want to give the State House a try? So essentially I was the constituent services representative for Jim.
Were you in Newburyport or at the State House, or both?
Both. Kind of split my time, usually 3 to 4 days in the State House and 1 to 2 days in Newburyport.
And then you were with Mayor Donna Holliday. What was the position that you had there, and what were some of your tasks at City Hall?
So, as Chief Administrative Officer for the city and for Mayor Holliday, it's kind of a chief of staff position. I was a liaison both between the city council, all of the department heads, and was the first point of contact. And would kind of disseminate information, to the mayor in order of importance, or, if there was a order and ordinance that, she felt strongly about, to negotiate with the city council. I did a lot of union contract negotiations. Attended all city council meetings, TSAC meetings, basically her right-hand man.
What was, as you look back on it, what were the years, first of all?
The years with Jim were, let's see.
Well, with Mayor Holliday, because my question's about city government.
Okay.
Actually.
So it was, see, we're in 2019. It was 2017 to 2018, about a year and a half.
And what were some of the issues that you worked with at the time? I think one of the things that occurred was you were planning a parking garage, but did that happen during your tenure?
It did. I helped Mayor Holliday. That was one of her project that she wanted to see pass through. There was some pushback on the city council. And my wife, who actually, we have a small business together, but she also sits on the board of directors for the North of Boston Visitors and Convention Bureau, and that promotes tourism within on the North Shore. And I'm happy to have worked on this project because, as Newburyport grows, Waterfront West is eventually going to happen. We're going to need infrastructure to handle that, and for us not to see that, I think would be short-sighted.
Mm-hmm. In terms of tourism right now, and we'll talk about the river in a moment, but the tourism on the North Shore seems quite vibrant. So, from you as a resident, but also maybe through talks with your wife, is this a good time for tourism on the North Shore here, Salisbury, Salem? Is it a good moment?
Sure. I think some cities are a little bit better at it than others. I'd love to see, it seems to me that there's some turnover in the shops downtown. Mm-hmm. I'd like to see kind of the Newburyport Chamber of Commerce and some of the shops and some of the building owners kind of get together and see how they can, have small businesses stay in their place of business for a little bit longer. I think it would be better for the city, more continuity.
Well, one of the things about Waterfront West, which you mentioned, and for listeners, this is a large project slated for almost empty area between the Black Cow and Michael's. And there's about 200 condominiums planned, perhaps an 80-room hotel planned, and also some retail. But I've seen a number of letters to the editor in the paper that say, geez, we don't need any more retail. Some of our stores, just as you said, have difficulty making it from year to year. Is there going to be a lot of retail there? And, is there a way to bring that to the attention of New England development?
Yes, there had been an ad hoc committee meeting, and they have met with New England Development, and they came up with the 200 plus condos available, but that did not pass. It was just voted down by the city last week. So it goes back to the original 2005 zoning. Now, I think we need to look at that and find kind of a happy medium between what was offered before and what was brought up in 2005. And that can limit the amount of shops. I've knocked on hundreds of doors, and I've heard a lot of people say they wouldn't mind a boutique hotel down there. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to kind of put that, especially on the tourism front, kind of put that not in stage 5, but maybe in stage 1 or 2.
I'm a former reporter for the Daily News, and I covered many of the meetings. And the meetings that I went to, this goes back 2 or 3 years ago, a lot of people said that. They said, well, geez, we could really use a hotel because if you have a wedding or a funeral, it would be nice to think you could book 6 or 8 rooms. But then the developers said, well, that might be one of the last things we do. So is there a way that city officials, and if you were a city councilor, could be influential in that area and say, look, let's talk about moving on the hotel sooner rather than later?
It would be a touchy negotiation because New England Development, that's what they do. They develop properties, okay? And to increase the cash flow to this specific property, they're probably going to have to at least do 1 or 2 phases first, so then they can, get to, what Newburyport wants. And it's not just a hotel, too. There's infrastructure that the city needs, from the sewage system that goes from Michael's Harborside to the water sewer treatment plant.
Very good point.
Traffic calming underneath the Route 1 bridge. We want the hotel. We want it to look nice, have, a nice brick facade, almost like a Beacon Hill, type of scene. So it is going to be a touchy negotiation, I think, because the city wants a lot, and Stephen Karp wants a lot.
One of the things that struck me about the hearings, at one point, the city actually had a consultant, which the city paid for, and that consultant was looking into retail. And he said, don't count on too much retail because in the next 5 to 10 years, shopping online is going to accelerate. So we have numerous shops downtown, and his point was, this is not the old days where you could just put in 20 shops and expect them to run. His concern was it might not be that vibrant down there, and it's harder to get there for a lot of people. Do you think there's room for more retail?
Maybe a limited amount of retail, but I'd like to, see some of these shop owners have been here a while. Like, as I said before, some of them have turned over. Mm-hmm. But I think the State Street is the crown jewel of the city, If I could, limit the amount of retail put down there and maybe widen some green space,
Mm-hmm.
But once again, that goes against, every developer's, playbook. So,
well, Fowles is a store, as we all know well, on State Street, and for years it had the same owners and had the best magazine and newspaper rack and on the North Shore, I felt. But, of course, that's been a restaurant 2 or 3 times since then. So, we have been talking about city issues, and you are running for city councilor at large. Can you talk, first of all, why you're running at large rather than from a ward, and then maybe you can talk about a couple of the issues that you talk about when you meet people. I know this because I live on Low Street, and Paul was there recently. He didn't even know I lived there, but at least, Paul, great. Now, I hope you're still going to be on my show on Tuesday. So anyway, talk a little about why you're running and some of the issues.
Well, I've lived in the city for 20 years. My daughter was born here. As you had pointed out, I've been Chief Administrative Officer for the city. I've been, the Constituent Services Rep. My wife and I have had a business here for 11 years. I've been a baseball, softball, and soccer coach for 7, 8 years. I've volunteered for Yankee Homecoming, and I'm currently the president of the Ancient Order Hibernians. I've contributed a lot to the city in several different capacities. And I'm going to make a small joke, and hopefully it'll play well on the radio and TV. I always said there's the guys who run across the graduation stage naked, and there's the guys who put them up to it. I was a great guy who put them up to it for a long time, but now it's my turn. And, I think some of the city councilors have been there on the city council for over a decade, and they've done a wonderful job. Mm-hmm. But sometimes, you need to kind of shake things up a little bit and, get fresh ideas and, act as a checks and balances, for the...
What ward are you in?
I'm in 4. Mm-hmm. So there's Christine Wallace is the, if you will, the elect councilor there. She's running unopposed.
Yeah, that's what Charlie Tonto
Charlie decided to run at large, which I found, rather surprising on that. Mm-hmm. I have a wide base of people as I just mentioned that around the city. So I just thought it would be prudent if I could kind of touch on all those bases, other than just stay in Ward 4.
So one thing you mentioned was retail, and at this, and of course I'll just mention again for our listeners, this is Life Along the Merrimack. I'm Dyke Hendrickson, the host. I'm talking to Paul O'Brien, who is running for councilor at large. When we talk about the river, Paul, and a lot of time in this show we do talk about the river because a lot of people are concerned that it's actually getting more polluted rather than less. In fact, talking about city councilors, former councilor Bob Cronin was on this show a couple of weeks ago, and he's a big boater. He has been for 20 or 30 years, and he said, in the last few years, sometimes, it's not fun to go out because you see junk or fecal matter, and this happens when some of the larger sewage treatment plants upriver get too much rainwater in, too much sewage in, it overwhelms the plant, and there's a sewage discharge. So, is there something can be done about this discharge, Paul, in a sense that, we know if there was $1 billion there, we could start with it, but there's not $1 billion there. So is there a way that we could look into it?
Well, it is going to be very expensive, without a doubt. But what I want to do is take it from the perspective of Newburyporters. That's who I'm running for, and that's who I'm hopefully representing. You're right. Raw sewage is 5 cities upriver, so it's Nashua, Manchester, Lowell, Lawrence, and Haverhill. And just even the large rainfall that we have last week, dumped sewage into the river. Currently, our state senator DeZoglio has put together a bill, Senate Bill 2309, that calls for a Merrimack River District Commission, and it has, looks like 15 state members and then 12 local members. I've seen how these boards work, and I think we need to move in congruence with them. But Newburyport, maybe Salisbury and Amesbury if we could, I think we need to do our own thing because, that's...
We are at the end of the line.
We are at the end of the line. This may not be the most popular idea, but I would suggest the first step be litigation against some of those cities upriver. I know everybody is, we're on the, possibly on the precipice of a recession, and I would never wish to hurt anybody's infrastructure. But once again, I said I was, representing the people of Newburyport, okay? And with that, I'd like to kind of get together a group and say, okay, it's almost like the old Yeats of Newburyport and say, we're Newburyport first, okay? At least we can all agree to stop dumping sewage in the river, okay, and having it, done down here. But that would also entail using certain political pressures on both our state and federal elected as well. Would have to reach out to Rep. Kelcourse and Senator Zoglio and Seth Moulton and Laurie Trahan and the 2 representatives from New Hampshire and say, listen, we're done. I read something today on the Merrimack River Watershed Council that at the current rate, it's going to take 25 years for them to fix this. I don't want to wait that long, because what has to happen? Does somebody have to get sick? Does those millions of discs need to be released in the river again? I mean, seriously, what has to happen for us to take the next step?
The discs was a really bad thing about 5 or 6 years ago. Some of you might remember a plant up in New Hampshire had a kind of a experimental technology going with discs, but the discs did not stay in place. They got out of the sewage treatment plant. They came down the river, and I remember covering that story. At first they said several thousand discs, then it was several 100,000, and now, there probably were at least 1 million, and one has been found in Portugal. So, I mean, they have a staying power, and even now you see them on the beach.
My family has a house in Wingersheep Beach in Gloucester, and just this year I found one in the dunes.
So, I mean, that's a good example that sometimes, we get the brunt of things. But, one of the things they have, Paul, in some areas is a taxing district. And like in Casco Bay in Portland, they have a water district. And a speaker I heard was talking about a rain tax. And they found that, in heavy rains, they were discharging into Casco Bay. So they came up with a tax or a little surcharge to say, within years or quarters that you have very heavy rain, we know there's going to be some more sewage out there. We're going to charge you a little more so we can build up an amount of money to eventually attack this. Do you think a taxing district or something like that is a possibility from Newburyport all the way up the river?
Well, I say start with Haverhill up the river, and then we'll, and then I'll try to sell that to Newburyport. I think Newburyport has enough taxes and fees for the moment.
Well, that's a good answer, but also I like your answer about litigation. And it might be remembered also that Lawrence actually gets a lot of its drinking water from the river. Now, granted, there's much science and they have a plant to purify it, but I think someday they would like to know that the water coming down the river is cleaner. Because when they started, the science of it about a century ago, I mean, these scientists from MIT and Harvard came up and they were studying, first of all, the illnesses, typhoid and diphtheria and cholera that were coming. No one knew at the time. They found out it was from bad water. So I think, also water for drinking water could be improved if things got better upriver.
Plus, it's just the right thing to do.
It is. It is the right thing to do. And, in the old days, Senator Ed Muskie was from Maine, and in 1972, he was able to lead the charge on the Clean Water Act. Do you see any federal legislation or federal movement that someone could step forward and not just for Newburyport or Massachusetts, but many rivers are under duress. Is there a possibility that federal aid would be possible?
It's always possible. You know what? If we could even get a small portion of the defense budget, I'd be thrilled. But like I said before, we need to we almost need to become a Newburyport caucus, where we need to pressure, the Senator Warren and Representative Moulton and Senator Markey, and said, you need to reach out to your co-elected officials in New Hampshire and Maine. And because, you know what, my constituents are getting angry. Mm-hmm. And you know what, I might not get voted in an election if we can come together on this. It can't be a Democrat or Republican thing. It needs to be a clean water thing.
Right. Well, Paul, when you walk around the community and you knock on doors, what are the things that you hear from people just when you sit down? Now, when I was a reporter, one of the big things, maybe always, has been, better sidewalks, better roads. Has the river ever come up, cleanliness in the river ever come up when you walk from neighborhood to neighborhood?
It does sometimes come up, but I often try to bring it up, and what I've said to at the door, people have been so positive on the responses. So like, that's exactly what I wanted to hear. As a matter of fact, I talked to a retired EPA lawyer up on High Street, and I'm supposed to be meeting with him, and hopefully he'll offer a few a rough blueprint on what the next steps need to be. But other than that, you're right, Dyke. It's streets and sidewalks and schools. It's I heard a lot. I heard from a 90-year-old woman on Marlborough Street last night. I forget her last name, and she said, well, the city's gotten really good at doing some of the big projects, the garage, the harbor master, the parks, the whatever. Can we bring it back to our sidewalks and streets and our neighborhoods and focus on that for a little while, and then pump the brakes on some of the bigger projects? I was at a meeting last night about school vaping, and how dangerous that was to. It's probably number one public health threat to our young kids today, and that's something I'd love to go after. Work with the schools. If I am lucky enough to be elected, I would love to be appointed to the Joint Committee on Education, because that's something I could help them out with.
Talking about schools, what is going to happen to the Brown School? And that's meant for people new to town. That closed 5 or 6 years ago. There have been numerous committee meetings and discussions on what to do with the school now. Where does that stand, Paul?
Right now it stands. I want to give some kudos to Councillor Sharif Zeid of Ward 1. He put together a tremendous ordinance that gave us a couple different options, one including senior housing, senior affordable housing. But it also, I believe, kept the option to keep the Newburyport Youth Services there. And I talked to a lot of people, and that's the last 2 nights I was walking around in Ward 1. And a lot of people, even though they're okay with affordable housing, but they want to know, why can't we keep the youth services there? I know the administration would like to put it across the street from the Knocknolan School.
Yeah, I mean, that's on Low Street, and from the school perspective, it works. But, of course, Brown School's right in the middle of a very large neighborhood, so on weekends, that's great for families.
Right, and I've heard people who love to go to the playground there, love to go to the basketball, and I think from an economic perspective, it would be a lot less expensive to redo what we have there. I'm getting a little nervous that the city seems to be selling off some of its assets, historical assets even, with the Brown School, instead of saying, okay, we talk about recycling in this city. Why not? Can't we recycle and repurpose, one of our assets, and being the Brown School?
Well, I noticed at the Kelly School on High Street, of course, the condos are finished. They're selling for about $1.1 million. So, the invisible hand of the market, I suppose, is taking care of that. But, when we talk about projects, how about the parking garage? Are you pleased with the way that worked out? And I just say to listeners that as a result of the parking garage going in, some parking has been taken off the waterfront, so that'll be a park. Do you think that combination will work out? We get parking and more park space?
I believe eventually it will work out. I'm not wild about how this transition happened so far, and that's another thing I've been getting on a few doors, is senior citizens, they love to go down, they love to have resident parking, they park down on the river, they go out on the bench, they have coffee with their friends, they watch the river go by, they watch the fecal matter go by, I thought maybe, would it be possible to put maybe 5 resident senior parking places on either side of the waterfront east and west. I was a little disappointed with the city that they took away the parks, the resident parking so quickly, and I'm not sure exactly why they did that. But I think it will give the community a chance to get used to the fact that this will be an expanded park, and it will be, after all is said and done, be better for the community.
Well, at one point, they were going to have condos and retail stores on the NRA land downtown. That did not come forth, in part because the mayor actually had what was called a charrette, which means you have the residents can come in and each person will talk about how they feel. And I was at that meeting, and 90% of the people who came to the charrette did not want the condos. Have you ever heard that there might be a charrette about Waterfront West?
I've been to, I don't know if it was officially called a charrette, but I've been to, both in the past 2.5 years, I'd say a dozen, just public meetings about that. I don't know if it's officially called a charrette, because I think you have to kind of, it's a smaller, more focused meeting. I would love that. But on the other side of it, I mean, it's basically a lot of those dozen meetings that I went to a lot of them were the same meeting. They want less size, less density, and there has to be kind of a voice that says, okay, this is what New England evolved, but this is what Newburyport wants, or we're going to leave the 2005 zoning as it is, and you're just going to have to figure it out. Now, that 2005 zoning doesn't require him to contribute much back to the city, so we have to be careful.
So what is the value of that, though, as it stands? Because what does that mean to a 2005 zoning?
I believe it's 135 units, but that's it. That's it's not. You don't have to put in. You don't have to put in a hotel. You don't have to. I'm not sure any infrastructure or let me rephrase that. Not how extensive the infrastructure improvements need to be. And I don't know if we would have a say on the design aspect of it either.
Well, it seems like the plot is thickening as far as that goes. And so the other thing is that'll keep moving. It's moving slowly now. Stephen Karp, who is the chairman of New England Development, recently spoke here in Newburyport. And he didn't give specifics. I think he tried to, be nice to everybody. But I had to kind of chuckle. Someone said, is there going to be enough parking, and especially with the retail stores and everything? And he said, well, a lot more people are taking Uber and Lyft. We don't need as many cars anymore. And I said, oh, really? Uber and Lyft, they can take them from Linfield and, Salem when they come to town.
I'm not sure if you're paying, over $800,000 to $1.2 million condo, how much Uber and Lyft you're going to be using.
And then, of course, someone pointed out that, if you move to the waterfront, you'd probably want to stay there the weekend. You need space. You need space for your friends to come in, your family to come in. So, the fellow-up did have a letter to the editor and said, basically, this is not providing enough parking spaces. So let's talk about that. But as you indicate, Paul, there's a lot more talking to be done. There'll be more negotiation. And if you're in the council, you'll be part of that. So we have about a minute to go. If you wanted to just remark on your campaign or what you hope you could do when you get there, just give us a few thoughts.
Okay. I have had the best time knocking on doors. I really have. My biggest problem is I stay in somebody's living room too long because I'll just talk their ear off. But what I'm also hearing is there's a certain segment of Newburyport that voices don't get heard. Okay, and it's the people who don't necessarily go to every single city council meeting or not have 3 or 4 kids and can't be don't have the bandwidth to kind of figure that out. I want to be not only the voices to the people who do come and do speak the loudest, but maybe some of the people who didn't hear about the marijuana zoning or the garage or anything else, and give them more input.
Well, that's good. I've been talking to Paul OBrien, who's running for councilor at large in Newburyport. I am Dyke Hendrickson, the host of this show, which is Life Along the Merrimack. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back next week, and here we talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. Thank you.